Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from the remote hollows of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1896 brought an early frost to the high ridges of western Virginia, where the ancient Appalachian peaks stretch like weathered fingers toward a gray sky. It was in this season of dying leaves and shortened days that residents of Grayson County first noticed the silence from Corvin's Ridge, an isolated spur of land that jutted out from the main mountain like a broken bone. Silas Corin had not been seen in the valley settlements for over 3 months, an absence that initially drew little concern from neighbors accustomed to the hermit-like existence of mountain folk. Silas Corin was known throughout the region as a man of few words and even fewer social connections. Born somewhere in the remote valleys of eastern Kentucky around 1834, he had drifted into the Blue Ridge Territory sometime in the early 1870s, purchasing a small tract of mountainous land from the estate of a deceased Confederate veteran. The deed, recorded at the Grayson County Courthouse, listed the property as 47 acres of steep woodland and rocky outcropping, unsuitable for cultivation, purchased for the modest sum of $12. Local records suggest Corin paid in silver coins, an unusual practice that generated quiet speculation about the source of his funds. The cabin he constructed on the ridge was typical of mountain architecture of the period, built from hand-hewn chestnut logs chinked with mud and moss. However, several features set Corin's dwelling apart from neighboring homesteads. Ezekiel Bramlett, who occasionally hunted the adjoining ridges, later described the structure as having unusually small windows, positioned higher than normal and facing specific directions that seemed to avoid the natural clearings below. The door, carved from a single piece of oak, was remarkably thick and fitted with iron hardware that Corin had apparently forged himself. For over 2 decades, Corin maintained a minimal but regular presence in the valley communities. He would descend the winding mountain paths once monthly to trade fur pelts and carved wooden implements for basic supplies at Mordecai Honeycutt's general store in Independence. These transactions were conducted in near silence, with Corin producing a written list of needed items and paying exactly the requested amount without negotiation. Honeycutt, interviewed years later by a traveling journalist, recalled that Corin never made idle conversation and seemed to possess an almost supernatural awareness of who else might be present in the store, often waiting outside until other customers departed before entering. The mountain man's appearance was as distinctive as his behavior. Standing well over 6 feet tall with a lean build that suggested both strength and privation, Corin wore his dark hair and beard, long but neatly maintained. His clothes, always clean but patched in multiple places, consisted of homespun wool and leather that he apparently manufactured himself. Most unsettling to those who encountered him were his eyes, described consistently as pale gray and possessing an intensity that made direct conversation uncomfortable. Jebediah Crockett, the local blacksmith, once remarked that talking to Corin felt like addressing a man who was listening to something else entirely, something the rest of us couldn't hear. During his years on the ridge, Corin developed a reputation as an exceptional craftsman and woodsman. The items he brought to trade, primarily hand-carved bowls and tool handles, displayed a level of skill that commanded premium prices. His knowledge of the mountain terrain was equally impressive, with local hunters occasionally seeking his guidance about game trails and weather patterns. However, these consultations were always brief and conducted outdoors, as Corin never invited visitors to his cabin and declined all invitations to social gatherings. The arrangement seemed to suit both Corin and the surrounding community. Mountain culture had always valued self-reliance and respected a man's right to solitude, particularly someone who caused no trouble and contributed useful goods to the local economy. If there was anything unusual about Silas Corin beyond his preference for isolation, it was his apparent complete lack of fear regarding the dangers that typically concerned mountain dwellers. He showed no concern about panthers, bears, or the occasional desperate men who fled to the mountains to escape law enforcement. Some attributed this fearlessness to his imposing physical presence, while others suggested a man who chose such complete solitude might have little left to lose. The events that would eventually lead to the sealing of Corin's cabin began in the late summer of 1896, though their exact nature would not become clear until much later. The first indication that something had changed came from Reuben Ashworth, whose property bordered the lower slopes of Corin's Ridge. In early August, Ashworth reported to neighbors that he had heard unusual sounds coming from the direction of the cabin during the pre-dawn hours. These sounds, which he described as rhythmic pounding followed by periods of complete silence, occurred intermittently over several nights before ceasing entirely. When questioned about the specific nature of these sounds, Ashworth struggled to provide a clear description. In testimony, later recorded by a county official, he stated that the pounding was not like chopping wood or building, but more like someone driving nails or stakes, but with long pauses between each strike, as if the person was listening for something after each blow. The sounds occurred only in the hours between midnight and dawn and seemed to move around the perimeter of the cabin rather than emanating from a fixed location. Other residents of the lower valleys reported different oddities during the same period. Lucinda Ashworth, Reuben's wife, mentioned that their hunting dogs had begun refusing to follow trails that led toward the ridge, a behavior change that coincided with the mysterious nighttime sounds. The dogs, normally eager to pursue any scent into the mountains, would approach the base of the ridge trail and then retreat with what she described as every hair standing on end and their eyes showing white with fear. Even more troubling were the observations of Phineas Goodwin, an elderly man who lived alone in a small cabin approximately 2 miles south of Corin's property. Goodwin, a former circuit preacher who had suffered a crisis of faith following the death of his wife in a typhoid outbreak, spent much of his time sitting on his front porch and observing the surrounding landscape. During the first week of September, he reported seeing smoke rising from Corin's chimney at unusual hours, particularly during the hottest part of the day when no reasonable person would maintain a fire for warmth. More disturbing was Goodwin's claim that the smoke appeared different from normal wood smoke, rising in a straight column even on windy days, and possessing a color that seemed to shift between gray and dark brown. When pressed for details, Goodwin acknowledged that his eyesight was not what it once had been, but insisted that something about the smoke troubled him in a way he could not articulate. In his words, recorded in a journal he kept sporadically, "There was something wrong about that smoke, something that made me think of burning things that ought not to be burned." The last confirmed sighting of Silas Corin occurred on September 23, 1896, when Mordecai Honeycutt observed him making his monthly supply run to the general store. This visit, however, deviated significantly from Corin's established routine. Instead of his usual written list, Corin requested specific items verbally, including an unusual quantity of iron nails, several coils of heavy rope, and multiple bags of lime. When Honeycutt expressed curiosity about the lime, as it was not an item Corin had ever purchased previously, the mountain man replied simply that he was making preparations. More unsettling was Corin's appearance during this final visit. Honeycutt later described him as having lost considerable weight, with his clothes hanging loose on his frame and his typically neat beard grown wild and unkempt. His hands, always calloused from manual labor, showed fresh wounds that appeared to be healing nail punctures or similar injuries. Most disturbing was his manner of speaking, which had changed from his usual brief, clear statements to a hurried, almost whispered style, as if he feared being overheard even in the empty store. Before departing, Corin made one final, unusual request. He asked Honeycutt if anyone had been inquiring about him or seeking directions to his cabin. When the storekeeper assured him that no such inquiries had been made, Corin nodded and then added, "If anyone comes asking, tell them Silas Corin is no longer receiving visitors. Tell them the door is closed and will remain so." These were the last words anyone in the valley community would hear from him. October passed without any sign of Corin, a situation that gradually transitioned from unremarkable to concerning as the weather grew colder. Mountain winters could be harsh and unpredictable, and even the most self-sufficient individuals typically maintained some contact with the outside world to ensure access to emergency assistance if needed. When November arrived with no smoke visible from Corin's chimney and no response to distant calls echoing across the ridge, several residents began to question whether intervention might be necessary. The decision to investigate was ultimately prompted by a disturbing discovery made by Tobias Caudle, a local hunter and trapper in his early 30s. While tracking a wounded deer through the lower slopes of Corin's Ridge in early November, Caudle discovered what appeared to be a hastily constructed barrier blocking the main trail that led to the cabin. The barrier consisted of fallen trees and large rocks arranged in a deliberate pattern with gaps too small for a person to pass through easily. Carved into one of the larger logs was a crude but unmistakable message: "Turn back now." When Caudle reported this discovery to his neighbors, the discovery initially seemed like Corin's way of discouraging unwanted visitors. However, the hunter's description of the barrier's construction troubled several residents. According to Caudle, the arrangement appeared to have been built from the cabin side of the trail, suggesting that Corin had been trying to keep something in rather than keep people out. This interpretation became more credible when Caudle mentioned finding several broken rope segments among the debris, as if restraining devices had been cut or torn. Tobias Caudle shared this information with Reuben Ashworth and Mordecai Honeycutt, and the three men agreed that someone should attempt to make contact with Corin before the full severity of winter set in. They selected Caudle for this task as he was the most experienced woodsman among them and had extensive knowledge of the mountain terrain in all weather conditions. On November 15, 1896, Caudle set out alone for Corin's cabin, carrying supplies for potential emergency assistance and prepared to spend the night in the mountains if necessary. The journey to the ridge normally required approximately 3 hours of steady hiking along established trails. However, Caudle encountered the barrier he had previously discovered within the first hour and found that circumventing it added considerable time and difficulty to the ascent. As he climbed higher, he discovered additional obstacles that had not been there during previous visits to the area. Trees had been felled across secondary paths. Large rocks had been rolled into strategic positions to block passage, and in several locations, crude spike barriers had been constructed from sharpened branches driven into the ground. These defensive preparations convinced Caudle that Corin was definitely still alive, but raised serious questions about his mental state and the reason for such elaborate precautions. The work represented weeks of intensive labor, suggesting that Corin had been systematically fortifying his territory rather than simply discouraging casual visitors. More troubling was the apparent progression of the barriers, which became more sophisticated and aggressive the closer they were positioned to the cabin. When Caudle finally reached the clearing where Corin's cabin stood, he was confronted with a sight that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. The structure itself appeared intact, but every opening had been sealed. The windows were covered with thick wooden boards nailed from the inside, with the nail points protruding outward in a manner that would injure anyone attempting to remove them. The door was similarly barricaded, but with an additional feature that demonstrated the extent of Corin's desperation. A secondary barrier of what appeared to be furniture and other household items had been constructed behind the main door, visible through gaps in the boarding. Around the cabin's perimeter, Caudle discovered evidence of even more disturbing activity. The ground was churned and disturbed in irregular patterns, as if something had been repeatedly dragged back and forth across the area. Multiple fire pits had been dug at various distances from the main structure, with each containing the charred remains of what appeared to be books, clothing, and other personal items. Most unsettling was a series of holes that had been dug around the cabin's foundation, each approximately 2 feet deep and filled with lime, the bags of which Corin had purchased during his final visit to the store. Despite repeated calls and attempts to make contact, Caudle received no response from within the sealed structure. He could detect no signs of recent activity, no smoke from the chimney, and no sounds to indicate habitation. The silence was complete and somehow unnatural, as if the cabin and its immediate surroundings existed in a state of suspension, separate from the normal rhythms of mountain life. Even wildlife seemed to avoid the area, with Caudle noting the absence of bird sounds or small animal movements that typically characterized Appalachian forests. As afternoon faded toward evening, Caudle made the decision to retreat rather than attempt to force entry into the cabin. The sealed nature of the structure, combined with the elaborate defensive barriers he had encountered during his ascent, convinced him that Corin had deliberately isolated himself for reasons that might not welcome outside interference. Additionally, the approaching darkness and the difficulty he anticipated in navigating the blocked trails at night made immediate return to the valley a necessity. Caudle's report to the other residents created considerable debate about the appropriate course of action. Some argued that Corin was an adult capable of making his own decisions, and that forcing entry into his deliberately sealed cabin would constitute an invasion of privacy. Others expressed concern that he might be ill, injured, or suffering from a mental breakdown that prevented him from seeking necessary help. The unusual nature of his preparations, particularly the defensive barriers and the systematic sealing of all openings, suggested behavior beyond normal eccentricity. The debate continued for several days before reaching a resolution that satisfied the community's obligation to investigate while respecting Corin's apparent desire for isolation. Mordecai Honeycutt, as the most prominent local businessman, agreed to report the situation to County Sheriff Cornelius Watkins in Independence. The sheriff could then make an official determination about whether the circumstances warranted intervention by legal authorities. Sheriff Watkins, a pragmatic man with over 20 years of experience in mountain law enforcement, initially expressed skepticism about the need for official involvement. Mountain residents frequently engaged in eccentric behavior, and the law generally supported a person's right to live as they chose on their own property. However, Honeycutt's detailed description of the defensive barriers and sealed cabin, combined with Corin's extended absence from any contact with the community, convinced Watkins that at least a formal welfare check was warranted. On November 28th, Sheriff Watkins, accompanied by Deputy Marshal Obadiah Prewitt and Tobias Caudle as a guide, set out for Corin's Ridge. The weather had turned bitterly cold, with intermittent snow flurries that made the journey more difficult than Caudle's previous attempt. However, the presence of law enforcement officials provided legal authority to remove barriers and, if necessary, force entry into the cabin to determine Corin's condition. The party encountered the same obstacles that Caudle had described, but with their combined efforts and appropriate tools, they were able to clear passages through the blocked trails. As they ascended toward the cabin, Deputy Prewitt documented the increasingly sophisticated nature of the barriers, noting in his official report that the defensive preparations appeared to have been constructed over an extended period and with considerable planning. The positioning of obstacles took advantage of natural terrain features and demonstrated knowledge of military engineering principles uncommon among civilian mountain residents. When the group reached the cabin clearing, Sheriff Watkins immediately understood why the situation had generated such concern among Valley residents. The sealed structure presented an appearance of deliberate fortification rather than simple home maintenance. Every opening had been secured with multiple layers of barriers, and the scattered evidence of burned possessions and disturbed earth around the perimeter suggested frantic activity during the period before final sealing. Sheriff Watkins called out several times, identifying himself and explaining his authority to conduct a welfare check. When no response came from within the cabin, he authorized Deputy Prewitt to begin removing the boards that covered the main door. This process required considerable time and effort, as the nails had been driven from the inside with such force that removing them without damaging the door structure proved nearly impossible. When the outer barriers were finally cleared, the party discovered that Corin had constructed an additional obstacle behind the main door. A barricade of furniture, tools, and other household items had been stacked and wedged against the entrance with such precision that opening the door more than a few inches required dismantling the entire arrangement piece by piece. The work appeared to have been done from inside the cabin, raising questions about how Corin had intended to exit the structure once it was completely sealed. As the interior barrier was gradually removed, a distinctive odor emerged from within the cabin that immediately caught the attention of all three men. The smell was not of decomposition, as might have been expected if Corin had died inside the sealed structure, but rather a complex mixture of smoke, lime, and something organic that none of them could identify. Deputy Prewitt later described it in his report as the smell of burning combined with something like wet earth and old leather. But underneath it all was something else, something that made you want to step away from the door even though you couldn't say why. When sufficient space had been cleared to allow entry, Sheriff Watkins entered the cabin alone, leaving Prewitt and Caudle outside as witnesses and backup. The interior presented a scene that defied easy explanation. The main room was largely empty, with most furniture having been used to construct the door barricade. However, the walls displayed evidence of extensive modification that had not been visible from outside the structure. Every interior wall surface had been covered with additional layers of wood planking, nailed in place with the same aggressive technique that had been used to seal the exterior openings. These interior barriers created a double wall system that would have significantly reduced the cabin's interior space while providing additional insulation and soundproofing. Between the gaps in this interior planking, Watkins could see that the original walls had been packed with what appeared to be a mixture of mud, lime, and organic material that might have included hair, cloth, or other fibrous substances. In the center of the main room, a large area of the floor had been removed, revealing the earth beneath the cabin's foundation. This excavation, approximately 6 feet square and 3 feet deep, had been carefully lined with flat stones and filled with a mixture that appeared to contain lime, ash, and other materials. The purpose of this modification was not immediately apparent, but its construction had clearly required significant time and physical effort. Against the far wall, Sheriff Watkins discovered what appeared to be Corin's final written communications, a series of brief messages carved directly into the wooden planking with a sharp tool. These inscriptions, scattered across multiple wall surfaces at various heights, created a chaotic pattern that suggested they had been made over an extended period under considerable emotional stress. The messages were brief and often incomplete, but their content provided the first direct insight into Corin's mental state during his final period of isolation. The earliest dated inscription, carved with relatively steady lettering, read, "August 30th, they know I am here now. Building defenses." This message was positioned near the door at normal eye level and appeared to have been created with deliberate care. However, subsequent inscriptions showed progressive deterioration in both handwriting quality and coherence of content. A message dated September 15th, carved higher on the wall and with noticeably shakier lettering, stated, "Sounds from below the floor again last night. They are getting closer. Must seal everything." Another inscription, undated but positioned at an unusual height near the ceiling, consisted of a single word repeated multiple times. Silent, 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 silent. The most disturbing inscriptions appeared to have been carved during the final days before the cabin was completely sealed. These messages, found near the floor level and barely legible, due to the apparent haste and desperation with which they had been created, included phrases such as, "Cannot sleep, they are underneath," and "Wrong to bring them here, wrong, wrong, wrong." The final inscription, discovered near what had once been the main window, consisted of a single sentence that would become central to subsequent attempts to understand Corvin's fate. "I should have left them buried where I found them." Sheriff Watkins documented the location and content of each inscription before conducting a thorough search of the remaining rooms. The cabin's bedroom had been similarly modified with interior wall reinforcement and sealed openings, but contained additional features that suggested Corvin had been preparing for an extended siege. Provisions had been stored in carefully organized caches, including preserved food, water containers, and basic medical supplies. However, these supplies appeared largely unused, suggesting that Corvin's isolation period had been shorter than he had originally planned. More puzzling was the complete absence of Corvin himself. Despite the elaborate preparations for extended isolation and the systematic sealing of all exits, no trace of the mountain man could be found within the cabin. His personal possessions remained in their expected locations, his tools were properly stored, and his winter clothing hung undisturbed in the bedroom. The sealed nature of the structure made it impossible for him to have left through any normal exit, yet he was simply not there. The mystery deepened when Deputy Prewitt, while examining the exterior of the cabin more closely, discovered that the lime-filled holes around the foundation contained more than just the chemical compound Corvin had purchased at the store. Mixed with the lime were fragments of what appeared to be bone, cloth, and metal objects that seemed much older than anything Corvin would have possessed. When these materials were carefully excavated and examined, they proved to include pieces of brass buttons in a style not manufactured for several decades, fabric fragments that appeared to be homespun wool of an earlier era, and bone fragments that included both human and animal remains. This discovery prompted a more extensive excavation of the area around the cabin, revealing evidence that the site had been used for burial purposes long before Corvin constructed his dwelling. The pattern of grave sites, marked by subtle depressions in the earth and changes in vegetation, suggested that multiple individuals had been interred in the area over an extended period. The age and arrangement of these burial sites indicated that they predated European settlement of the region, possibly representing a Native American cemetery or sacred site. The implications of this discovery cast Corvin's final messages in an entirely different light. His reference to bringing them to the site and leaving them buried suggested that he had somehow disturbed these original graves, possibly during the construction of his cabin or subsequent modifications to the property. His final period of psychological deterioration could then be understood as guilt and fear resulting from this desecration, combined with the isolation and stress of mountain living. However, this explanation failed to account for several disturbing aspects of the case. The elaborate defensive barriers Corvin had constructed were designed to prevent something from reaching the cabin, not to keep himself confined within it. His systematic sealing of the structure from the inside suggested that he believed he was protecting himself from an external threat, rather than preventing himself from leaving. Most puzzling was his complete disappearance from a building that had been sealed so thoroughly that normal exit would have been impossible. Sheriff Watkins concluded his official investigation by documenting the evidence and filing a report that classified Corin's case as a disappearance rather than attempting to determine the specific cause or circumstances. The condition of the cabin and the nature of the defensive preparations suggested severe mental disturbance, possibly triggered by guilt over disturbing Native American graves or by the extreme isolation of mountain living. However, the physical evidence did not support any definitive conclusion about what had ultimately happened to Silas Corin. The investigation's findings were reported in the Independence newspaper, generating considerable interest and speculation throughout the region. However, the remote location of the cabin and the approaching winter weather discouraged casual visitors from attempting to examine the site themselves. The property remained undisturbed throughout the winter months, with local residents generally avoiding the area and respecting the official conclusion that the case represented a tragic example of mountain isolation affecting an already unstable individual. When spring returned to the Blue Ridge in 1897, the first visitors to return to Corbin's Ridge made a discovery that added another layer of mystery to the already puzzling case. Tobias Caudill, the same hunter who had originally discovered the trail barriers, found that the cabin had been completely destroyed during the winter months. The structure had not simply collapsed under snow load or suffered damage from normal weather exposure, but appeared to have been systematically dismantled and scattered. The logs that had formed the cabin walls were scattered throughout the clearing and down the mountainside, as if they had been thrown with considerable force rather than simply falling. The stone foundation remained intact, but the careful excavation that Sheriff Watkins had documented was now filled with earth and debris. Most significantly, the lime-filled holes around the foundation had been disturbed and refilled, with no trace remaining of the bone and artifact fragments that had been discovered the previous autumn. This destruction occurred during a winter when heavy snow would have made access to the ridge extremely difficult for normal travelers. The systematic nature of the dismantling suggested deliberate human activity rather than natural collapse, but the remote location and harsh weather conditions made it unlikely that outside parties would have undertaken such extensive work. Local residents offered no explanations for the cabin's destruction, and no one admitted to visiting the site during the winter months. The mystery of Corbin's Ridge gradually faded from local discussion as other concerns occupied the attention of valley residents. The property eventually reverted to the county for unpaid taxes and was subsequently sold to a lumber company that harvested the remaining timber before abandoning the land to natural reforestation. For several decades, the site was marked only by the remnants of the stone foundation and occasional artifacts discovered by hunters or hikers who happened across the clearing. In 1923, a survey team working for the newly established Shenandoah National Park conducted a systematic examination of the area as part of their land acquisition research. Their report, filed with federal authorities but not widely distributed, documented several unusual features at the former site of Corbin's cabin that suggested the location had a more complex history than local residents realized. The survey team's findings included evidence of multiple construction episodes dating to different historical periods. Below the foundation of Corbin's cabin, they discovered traces of an earlier structure that appeared to predate European settlement by several decades. This earlier construction utilized building techniques and materials consistent with late 18th century frontier architecture, suggesting that the site had been occupied by settlers or hunters during the earliest period of westward expansion. More intriguing were the survey team's discoveries related to the pre-Columbian use of the site. Systematic excavation revealed artifacts and burial evidence confirming that the location had been used as a Native American cemetery for an extended period, possibly spanning several centuries. The arrangement of grave sites followed patterns typical of Cherokee or related southeastern tribes, with certain areas apparently reserved for individuals of special status or significance. The survey report noted that these burial sites showed evidence of multiple disturbances over time, including the European-era construction and Corvin's later modifications. However, the pattern of disturbance suggested that each successive occupant of the site had eventually abandoned it after a relatively brief period, creating a cycle of use and abandonment that spanned multiple generations. The report speculated that local knowledge of the site's burial significance might have contributed to its eventual abandonment by each group of occupants. Among the artifacts recovered by the survey team were several items that appeared to correlate with Silas Corin's period of residence, including metal fragments that matched the description of the materials Sheriff Watkins had discovered in the lime-filled holes. However, the survey also uncovered objects that seemed to predate Corin's occupation, including personal items that appeared to belong to the earlier European occupants of the site. These findings suggested that Corin's experience at the ridge might not have been unique, but rather part of a pattern of disturbance and abandonment that characterized the location's history. Each successive occupant appeared to have eventually left the site under circumstances that prevented them from taking their personal possessions, creating an accumulation of artifacts that spanned multiple historical periods. The survey team's report remained classified for security reasons related to the national park development, but copies were eventually made available to academic researchers in the 1940s. Dr. Harold Wickham, a historian specializing in Appalachian settlement patterns, reviewed the survey findings as part of a broader study of frontier land use and abandonment cycles. Dr. Wickham's analysis, published in a limited academic journal in 1948, placed Corin's case within the context of documented psychological phenomena affecting isolated mountain residents. He identified similar cases of extreme defensive behavior, systematic sealing of dwellings, and eventual disappearance among frontier settlers who occupied remote locations for extended periods. His research suggested that these incidents represented predictable psychological responses to isolation stress, particularly when combined with guilt over disturbing burial sites or other culturally sensitive locations. However, Dr. Wickham's research also revealed aspects of the Corin case that did not fit standard psychological profiles. The sophistication of the defensive barriers and the systematic nature of the cabin modifications suggested planning and engineering knowledge beyond the typical capabilities of an isolated mountain resident suffering from mental breakdown. The coordination required to construct multiple barrier lines and implement complex sealing procedures indicated that Corin had retained considerable rational capacity even during his final period of apparent psychological distress. More puzzling was the pattern of similar cases Dr. Wickham identified throughout the Appalachian region. His research documented at least 12 incidents of isolated residents engaging in defensive fortification, followed by mysterious disappearance, all occurring at locations that were later confirmed to have been used for Native American burials. The consistency of behavioral patterns across different time periods and geographical locations suggested something beyond coincidental psychological breakdown. Dr. Wickham's final report included a recommendation that the former site of Corin's Ridge be designated as culturally sensitive and restricted from future development or disturbance. This recommendation was implemented by the National Park Service, which classified the area as an archaeological preserve requiring special permits for research access. The site remains restricted to this day, with only occasional academic expeditions permitted to conduct limited studies under strict supervision. The most recent investigation of the site was conducted in 1961 by a team from the Smithsonian Institution, working under the direction of Dr. Margaret Thornfield, an anthropologist specializing in southeastern Native American cultures. Dr. Thornfield's team conducted a comprehensive excavation of the entire clearing using modern archaeological techniques to document the site's complete history of use and abandonment. The Smithsonian expedition confirmed many of the earlier survey findings while adding new details about the site's significance to Native American communities. Their research indicated that the location had been used for burial purposes for over 4 centuries, with evidence of continuous ceremonial use well into the early 19th century. The site's importance appeared to derive from natural features that held religious significance, including underground water sources and unique geological formations. Dr. Thornfield's report also addressed the mystery of the successive European occupants and their eventual abandonment of the site. Her team discovered evidence that each group of settlers had initially disturbed the burial areas during construction, then later attempted to restore or seal the graves before abandoning their dwellings. This pattern suggested that the settlers had gradually become aware of the site's significance and had attempted to correct their intrusion, but had ultimately concluded that continued occupation was inappropriate. The report noted that Silas Corin's case fit this pattern, but represented its most extreme manifestation. His extensive defensive preparations and systematic sealing of his cabin suggested not only recognition of his intrusion, but also fear of consequences that he believed might result from his disturbance of the burial site. His final disappearance, while still unexplained, occurred within the context of what appeared to be an attempt to barricade himself against some perceived threat. Dr. A. Thornfield's conclusions emphasized the psychological impact of cultural transgression on isolated individuals who lacked community support systems to help them process guilt and anxiety. Her report suggested that Corin and the other European occupants of the site had suffered from what would now be recognized as severe anxiety disorders, triggered by their awareness of having violated sacred space, but exacerbated by isolation and lack of appropriate guidance for addressing their situation. The Smithsonian report was published in 1963 and remains the definitive academic study of the site's history and the pattern of abandonment that characterized its European occupation. However, the report did not attempt to explain the specific circumstances of Corin's disappearance or the destruction of his cabin during the winter of 1896-1897. These aspects of the case remained classified as unexplained historical mysteries rather than subjects for scientific analysis. Local oral tradition in the valleys surrounding Corin's Ridge preserved memories of the incident long after official investigations concluded. These folk narratives, collected by WPA writers during the 1930s as part of federal documentation projects, provided perspectives on the case that differed significantly from academic and legal interpretations. According to elderly residents interviewed during the Depression era, Silas Corin's fate was understood within the community as an example of what happened when outsiders failed to respect local traditions and sacred places. The stories emphasize that mountain residents had always known the ridge was a burial ground and had avoided disturbing it, but that Corin, as a newcomer to the region, had not understood these local customs. The folk narratives also preserved details about Corin's final months that had not been included in official reports. Several elderly informants recalled family members mentioning that Corin had been observed conducting activities around his cabin during the summer of 1896 that suggested he was attempting to relocate or rebury objects he had previously disturbed. These activities, conducted primarily at night, involved systematic excavation and reinterment of materials around the cabin's foundation. Most significantly, the oral tradition preserved a different interpretation of Corin's defensive barriers and cabin ceiling. Rather than viewing these preparations as evidence of mental breakdown, local residents understood them as Corin's attempt to isolate himself while he worked to undo the damage he had caused to the burial site. His disappearance was viewed not as a mystery, but as a predictable consequence of his failure to properly address his transgression before winter made continued work impossible. These alternative interpretations were not accepted by academic researchers who viewed folk narratives as unreliable sources influenced by superstition and cultural bias. However, the consistency of local accounts across multiple informants and their coherence with known facts of the case suggested that community memory might have preserved accurate details about Corvin's final months that were not captured in official investigations. The case of Silas Corin and his sealed cabin became part of broader regional folklore about the dangers of disturbing sacred sites and the consequences of failing to respect indigenous cultural traditions. Similar stories were collected throughout the Appalachian region, creating a body of oral literature that served both as entertainment and as cultural instruction about appropriate behavior in mountain environments. As the 20th century progressed, access to Corvin's Ridge became increasingly restricted due to its designation as an archaeological preserve. The site was eventually incorporated into the boundary of Shenandoah National Park, where it remains today under federal protection. Only researchers with specific permits are allowed to visit the location, and casual hiking or camping in the area is prohibited. The restricted status of the site has contributed to its continued presence in regional folklore, with the mystery of Corvin's disappearance serving as the basis for numerous local legends and stories. These contemporary narratives often emphasize the inexplicable aspects of the case while minimizing the cultural and historical context that academic research has provided. Modern visitors to the general area of Corvin's Ridge, while unable to access the specific site, often report experiencing unexplained sounds and atmospheric disturbances that they associate with the historical events that occurred there. Park rangers familiar with the site acknowledge these reports, but attribute them to normal mountain environmental factors combined with visitors' knowledge of the location's history. The case continues to attract interest from researchers studying historical patterns of European settlement in areas previously used by Native American communities. Corvin's experience has been cited in numerous academic studies as an example of the psychological consequences of cultural transgression, particularly in isolated environments where individuals lack community support systems. Contemporary psychological analysis of the case focuses on Corvin's apparent development of severe anxiety and paranoid behaviors in response to his recognition that he had disturbed sacred burial sites. His defensive preparations and systematic isolation are viewed as maladaptive coping mechanisms that ultimately failed to address the underlying source of his psychological distress. However, the specific circumstances of his disappearance from a completely sealed cabin remain unexplained by any conventional psychological or forensic analysis. The physical evidence documented by Sheriff Watkins and subsequent investigators continues to challenge efforts to provide a definitive explanation for how Corvin left the structure or what became of him after its final sealing. The destruction of the cabin during the winter following Corvin's disappearance adds another layer of mystery that has never been satisfactorily explained. The systematic nature of the dismantling occurring during a season when access to the site would have been extremely difficult suggests human agency, but provides no clear indication of who might have undertaken such work or why. Recent discussions of the case in academic literature emphasize its significance as an example of the complex relationships between European settlers and the indigenous landscapes they occupied. Corvin's story illustrates both the practical consequences of cultural insensitivity and the psychological impact of transgression in environments where individuals lack appropriate frameworks for understanding and addressing their actions. The case also demonstrates the limitations of historical documentation in preserving complete records of frontier experiences. The official investigations of Corvin's disappearance, while thorough by the standards of their time, failed to capture many aspects of the incident that were preserved only in oral tradition or remained completely undocumented. Modern visitors to the Shenandoah National Park often express interest in learning more about Corvin's Ridge and the events that occurred there in 1896. However, park interpretation programs generally focus on broader themes of European settlement and Native American displacement rather than the specific details of individual cases like Corvin's. The restricted access to the actual site ensures that Corvin's Ridge remains largely undisturbed, allowing the location to maintain whatever cultural and spiritual significance it held for the indigenous communities who originally used it for burial purposes. This protection also preserves any remaining archaeological evidence that might eventually contribute to a better understanding of the site's history and the events that led to Corvin's disappearance. The enduring mystery of Silas Corin continues to serve as a reminder that historical records, no matter how carefully maintained, cannot always provide complete explanations for the experiences of individuals who lived in isolation from larger communities. Some stories remain incomplete, their central mysteries preserved in the landscape itself, rather than in the written documents that attempted to record them. Perhaps the most appropriate conclusion to the case of Corvin's Ridge is not an explanation, but an acknowledgement that some aspects of human experience resist complete documentation and analysis. The mountain man who sealed his cabin in 1896 left behind evidence of his final months, but no clear answer to the question of what ultimately became of him. The site where his cabin once stood continues to exist within the protected boundaries of the national park, marked by natural processes of reforestation and the gradual erasure of human modifications to the landscape. The stone foundation that once supported Corvin's dwelling has been largely obscured by accumulated earth and vegetation, creating a scene of peaceful wilderness that gives little indication of the dramatic events that occurred there more than a century ago. Yet for those who know the history of the location, the silence of Corvin's Ridge carries echoes of the mystery that brought it to broader attention. The questions that could not be answered in 1896 remain unanswered today, preserved in the very landscape where Silas Corin made his final inexplicable preparations for a threat that only he could perceive. The story serves as a reminder that the mountains have always held secrets, and that some doors once sealed were perhaps meant to remain closed forever.